Today, we're really diving deep into this electricity situation in Nigeria. And you guys have sent in some fascinating firsthand accounts and some pretty in-depth analysis for us to use. So are you ready to go from, this is interesting, to, whoa, I get it now?
Let's shed some light on those flickering lights, shall we?
I love it. Okay, so the sources paint a picture that's way more than just a minor inconvenience. Like one article even described it as a nationwide game of red light, green light, except it's your refrigerator that's in the dark, not some childhood game.
That's a really powerful image, and it gets right to the heart of the issue. The World Bank actually estimates that these power outages cost Nigeria a significant amount of its GDP every year. And that's before even considering the human cost.
Wow, yeah, that really puts it in perspective.
Mhm.
And speaking of everyday experiences, we kept seeing this phrase pop up in the articles, up NEPA. What's that all about?
It's really quite telling. Up NEPA is this almost like joyous exclamation people shout when the power comes back on after an outage.
Yeah.
So it really highlights just how frequent these outages are in daily life.
So it's like a collective sigh of relief. But also kind of sad that it's become so normal, you know? Like imagine celebrating when your water comes back on after being off for a few hours.
Exactly. It shows how reliable electricity isn't just about comfort. It's vital for hospitals, schools, businesses. When the power cuts out, it affects every aspect of life and hinders economic growth.
It's like this one story we read about a shop owner in Lagos. Every time the power goes out, he has to use this expensive, smelly diesel generator just to keep his business running. And it ends up cutting into his profits and polluting the air.
And that's a story you hear all across Nigeria. The reports show that many businesses and even homes rely heavily on these diesel generators, which are not only expensive but also noisy and pollute the air, impacting public health.
And speaking of challenges, one source used the analogy of Nigeria's national power grid being like dominoes. They said that if one thing goes wrong, the whole system can collapse. Why is it so fragile?
It's a pretty fitting comparison. The national grid relies on something called spinning reserve. It's essentially a backup power source that can quickly come online if something goes wrong. Think of it like a spare tire in your car.
Okay, I see. So no spare tire equals big problems.
Exactly. And unfortunately, the sources say that Nigeria often doesn't have enough spinning reserve. This means that even small disruptions can cascade through the system and lead to those widespread blackouts that we've been hearing about.
Okay, so no spare tire for this power grid. And on top of that, I remember something about a leaky water balloon. Something about keeping up with demand. What was that all about?
Right, imagine trying to fill up a bucket, but it has a hole in it. That's kind of what Nigeria is dealing with.
Yeah.
The country has what's called a significant energy deficit, meaning there just isn't enough electricity being generated to meet everyone's needs.
Especially in those really crowded cities we were talking about.
Exactly. Lagos, for example. It's a megacity, completely packed with people, and their energy needs just completely outstrip the available supply. And that's where that leaky balloon idea comes in. It shows how hard it is to get ahead when you're always losing ground.
So we've got this super fragile grid that's always on the verge of collapsing. And on top of that, we can't even generate enough power to meet demand. That's, well, it's a recipe for disaster, isn't it?
It's definitely a huge challenge. And to make things even harder, we have to talk about the elephant in the room, the outdated equipment.
Yeah, one expert called it trying to power a modern city with a system designed for a much smaller population.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. A lot of the equipment is just old. Some of it is decades old. Remember that shop owner we talked about earlier who has to rely on that diesel generator? Imagine that, but on a national scale. It's just not efficient or cost effective, and it's definitely not sustainable. This aging infrastructure just can't handle the demands of a growing and modernizing country.
Okay, so we've got the fragile grid, we've got the energy deficit, and to top it all off, we've got outdated equipment. It's like we've diagnosed this patient with the flu, a broken leg, A&D, a head cold all at the same time. But thankfully, our sources didn't just give us problems, they actually offered some potential solutions. So where do we even start with untangling this mess?
You're right, it's not all doom and gloom. One of the most promising things we saw is this idea of decentralization, basically moving away from relying so much on this one really fragile national grid.
So kind of like states becoming more self-sufficient, generating their own power, so each state would have its own power grid.
Exactly. It's about diversifying and creating solutions tailored to the needs of each region. Imagine each state using its own resources, whether it's solar, wind, or hydropower, to become more energy independent.
Wow, that would be amazing. And when you think about it, that could lead to a ton of innovation and create a lot of jobs.
For sure. This shift towards decentralized energy could really spark a wave of new ideas and create local experts. It's more than just building power plants. It's about building a whole new energy ecosystem.
Okay, so we've got these more localized state-level solutions that could really change things. But realistically, this sounds like a huge project. What needs to happen to make this shift actually happen?
You've hit on a really important point. It's about more than just infrastructure. One of the sources talked about needing skilled workers, people who know how to manage these modern decentralized systems.
So it's not just about building new power plants, it's about having people who can run them well.
Exactly. And the sources actually suggested this idea of a brain gain for Nigeria, attracting skilled workers back who left the country and investing in education and training at home. They need experts in everything: grid management, renewable energy technologies, you name it.
That makes a lot of sense. You need people who can build this new energy future for Nigeria A&D, keep it running smoothly.
Absolutely. And that's where the innovative solutions we talked about come in. Remember those renewable energy sources, solar, wind, and hydropower? They could be huge for Nigeria.
You mentioned earlier that Nigeria relies a lot on gas plants right now. So is the goal to get rid of those completely and switch to renewables? Or is it more about finding a balance?
That's a great question.
Hmm.
A complete switch might not be realistic right away, but the sources all seem to agree that moving towards renewables is crucial. Nigeria has so much potential: abundant sunshine, strong wind in some areas, and untapped hydropower. Using these resources could really change the game.
One article mentioned these solar mini-grids that are already being used in some rural areas. That sounds really promising.
Absolutely. Those mini-grids are a perfect example of the localized solutions we're talking about. They bring power to places that aren't connected to the main grid. They improve living standards and empower communities.
This is all great,
Hmm.
but this is where I always get stuck. What can a regular person actually do to help make this change happen? It feels like such a big, complicated issue.
I think a lot of people feel that way. But here's the thing, awareness is powerful. Just knowing about this problem and having informed conversations about it is a huge step.
So knowledge is power, even in a power crisis.
Exactly. And beyond awareness, think about your own energy use. Could you look into off-grid solutions, like solar panels for your house? Even small changes can lead to a bigger shift in how we think and act.
That's a great point. We shouldn't just wait around for big changes. We can all make conscious choices in our own lives. Maybe this deep dive will inspire people to take a closer look at their own energy use. We've covered a lot today. But one thing we didn't really get to in these sources is the role of private companies and investment in all of this. How do they fit into this future with decentralized renewable energy for Nigeria? It seems like we could do a whole other deep dive just on that. That's something to think about as we wrap things up here. Thanks for joining us.